Hi, I'm Jean Nolte, editor at Fons & Porter.
And I'm Colleen Tauke. I'm the sewing specialist with Fons & Porter. In this tutorial, we are going to show you how to create the flight pattern quilt.
For the pattern for this quilt, go to shopfonsandporter.com/quiltingquickly. Okay, this is a fun quilt that's made with flying geese units that are all triangles, but the really neat thing about it is you cut only squares to make this quilt.
The entire quilt.
So we're going to start with a pack of pre-cut 10-inch squares. We need 40 of these 10-inch squares, and for each 10-inch square you'll need 4 small 5¼ squares for the background. And we'll be making these flying geese units, and lots of them.
Right. And the reason why we call it flight pattern, then it ties in with the whole flying geese idea. It kind of looks like a goose in flight.
So the first thing we're going to do is mark sewing lines on the small squares. I'm taking this 1/4-inch seam marker, place the yellow line exactly on the corners. I'm going to hold it down, draw a line on one side, and then I'm going to go over here, draw a line on the other side. Now, if you don't have this 1/4-inch seam marker, you can draw a line with a regular ruler from corner to corner, and then draw another line a 1/4-inch away on each side from your center line.
It's kind of a nice investment. That 1/4-inch seam marker, it saves a lot of time, makes things very accurate.
Right, and this is the smaller one. There's another one that comes in the set too that's a little bit longer, but we don't need that one today. So the first thing we're going to do is take these 2 of these squares that we've marked and put them on the big square, and we want to get those lines lined up.
The small squares are going to overlap, so don't think you've made a mistake on cutting. They are going to overlap and kiss right here in the center. You're just going to want to make sure that the lines then match up, and so that your seam line is going to go all the way across the block. And because this one's a little bit larger, I sometimes want to put in a couple of pins because I'm going to slide this over to the sewing center here, and I don't want things to become misaligned. So just a couple of pins on each of the blocks as we go across, and we'll be ready to sew.
All right.
Okay, when we put this under the sewing machine, one little tiny tip is that you've marked a 1/4-inch seam, but if we can just stay to the inside of that line just a little, we will create a perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance. And instead of starting and stopping, I'm going to sew all the way across this. Instead of breaking thread, I'm going to jump to the other side and stitch back across my block. And take your pins out as you come to them. Some sewing machines you can stitch over pins. Others like to eat pins.
Those pins are pretty thin, but even so, I like to take them out.
We don't want to damage the tip of our needles, so take them out as you approach them. As I get to the other side, I'm going to raise my presser foot, leave the needle dropped in place, jump to the other side of the line, and come right back. Now, of course, we're sewing with red thread. You wouldn't have to do that at home. You'd be sewing with a thread that probably, in this project, would probably be a cream color thread, so that this thread would not show.
Right.
So across.
And I would get a lot of these ready, and you could be chain piecing those one after another. You don't have to just do one at a time, but today we're just doing one.
Okay.
So the next thing we're going to do is cut this apart, and I'm going to use a ruler, but you wouldn't have to because it doesn't matter. It just makes it a little easier to make that long cut.
Your accurate seam allowance has already come from sewing right on the marked line.
Right.
So we come.
So after we do that, the next thing we're going to do is some pressing. So I'm going to put this out here. The first thing I like to do is set my seam, and we're going to press toward the light, which is backwards from what we sometimes talk about. But to make this work, we need to press toward the small triangle.
Make sure that you open up your seam all the way to the stitching line.
Right.
Don't leave a false stitch in there, because you need all of that fabric to make your block stay accurate.
All right. Now, we're going to press both of those, but I'm just going to do one for now. I'll put this one out here for later. So the next thing you would do is take one of the other leftover squares and put one on each of these units.
When you're aligning the small square for the a third of those that you're using, make sure that you align on the outside corners here. It's going to overlap and go off of that V shape there. So what we're going to do is put in a couple pins so it won't slide as we take it to the sewing machine. Again, like we did earlier. We're going to move over here to the sewing center. And again, I'm going to sew down that line, jump across, the same mode I did before. Now, when people traditionally made the flying geese unit, they were cutting all kinds of triangles and rectangles. The more cutting that we do, the more chance we have for error. And in this process, we don't cut as many pieces, and we come up with very accurate pieces in the end. So, going back across.
This looks a little funny while you're doing it, but it comes out perfect.
The very first time I did this process, I thought, really? How am I going to get units out of this?
Yeah,
So,
if you would hand me the rotary cutter there.
okay.
While you sew that other
Right.
one, I'm going to cut this one apart.
Exactly. That was block number 3 here. We're going to use block number 4. So that sometimes I like to look at it at one point, these look like large hearts. And you know that you're on the right track when you see the heart. Just loving our quilting, aren't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so while you sew, I'm going to be pressing these 2 units.
Okay. Now they're going to start looking like flying geese when you open them up.
All right. I always like to set that seam first and then press it toward the small triangle.
Exactly. Just going to cut it. I'm going to jump over to the other side. Okay.
All
The
right.
nice part is that we're going to get 4 of the exact same block at a time here, so that we're quickly making all the flying geese that go into this project.
All right.
And,
And then I'm going to trim these.
okay.
You could use your ruler and rotary cutter, or you could just take scissors and you want to just trim off those little points that stick out to make these nice rectangles. It's kind of thick there, but
Sometimes you call those dog ears. Just give them a
so
little
you
clip.
would trim each of your units as you go.
So we would have 1, 2. When we open and press this,
Right.
magically, here's block number 3,
I'm going to cut those
and
apart.
here's block number 4.
I can cut
So I'm
those
gonna cut
apart so
those.
you can see what we've got.
Sometimes
so
when I'm making these units and they're smaller, I just use a scissors to snip across there. The longer the line, I sometimes will just put them all out on the cutting mat at once and cut a bunch of them. So
right. So I'm going to put that over aside here.
here's a tip too. When you're going to open these seams, fingernail, you can finger press
Sorry,
them.
finger press.
and-
So there we
and get
have
the seam open all the
4
way.
flying geese units,
Okay.
all made
now
from squares. So the next thing we're ready to do,
is to make that subunit that goes within the block in the pattern.
we're going to start getting ready to make blocks. So we're going to sew 2 together here like this in pairs. You'll need 8 for each block. So you take your 2, lay them out the way you want them, then flip them over. And we're going to sew on this edge.
Now I've marked on this one where you're sewing, where your stitching line's going to be, because what I want you to look for here is this sweet spot where these 2 seams intersect. That will give you a point, the nose of the goose, when you get done putting the block together. So let's actually sew this one. You can see what I'm going to do. And there aren't many other components in this block except those triangles, so we want them to be neat and tidy. So we come in here and try to hit right to the sweet spot, that intersection. You're going to make it look kind of like an asterisk when you get done. It's a thick spot. Sometimes my machine would go kind of thunk, and I know I've hit the very center of it perfectly. Okay, so fingers crossed when we open this, we'll have a point.
Press that toward the top triangle.
You press
the
this
green.
direction. See, we've got a perfect point there in the center.
So you're pressing away from the point of that triangle.
There's a lot of bulk there, so trying to make that one go the other direction, Goose just doesn't want to fly that way. He wants to go where his nose will lead him.
Let me give that a quick press with the iron here.
Sometimes people say, oh, I hate to press, I hate to press. But if you don't press as you go, it makes it a lot harder in the end to get your units then put into blocks.
Okay.
Everything nice and flat, it's a good thing.
Got that seam opened up nicely. Okay, so we're going to lay out 4 of these units in pairs.
And notice they're all flying in different directions. They all have their own flight pattern.
So this would be a block. Now, we chose 4 matching pairs, and it makes a secondary pattern that
If
looks
you'd
like a
like.
pinwheel in the center. If you don't want that, just make them all random colors, like
I
the one
know.
on the wall, and that
It
won't
won't
happen. So now what we're going to do is join these into rows. So I'll flip this over, and we don't want to sew on this side because we can't see the intersection. So we want to flip it over so Colleen can sew on that side.
I'm going to show you just a little tip. Now when you go to put these units to make them into rows, the sweet spot of the block is this point of the triangle out here on the outer edge. In order to be able to hit that and not lop it off, what we can do is put a pin down through there, match the outer corners. So we know that's where we want those to match. And a little tip then to get that center so that it doesn't shift. I've left that pin straight up and down. I haven't put it all the way through. I'm going to put it through, but I'm not going to make it a pin.
So you're
like
not
this.
going to angle
I'm gonna,
it at all?
Yes, I'm make it like the North Pole. It's going to drop straight down through. Now I'm going to go back and put a pin in place.
That's a second pin.
Because it stays in place, it doesn't shift, doesn't slide. So when I take this one out, everything's
And you're
where I
pinning
want
in
it to be.
front of the seam allowance, not through the thick part.
Right.
through the-
If you try to go through that thick part, one's going to slide over the top of the other, and you'll have a shift. So now that when I put it in the machine, the idea is that I can hit that point. Whoops, I've got to get my pin out of the way there. Get up to it.
So when you get there, that should be just a perfect 1/4 inch seam. You'll have perfect
you know-
points when you open that up.
Everybody has a different comfort zone. If it's a little blunted, sometimes people doesn't bother them, that's okay too. But if you want to work on that skill, this is one you can do to
And of
work
course,
on
you
it.
could be chain piecing these, so that's going to go the
But when you
other
come
way.
in here, now when
Yeah.
she opens it up,
Whoops.
she'll show you how that intersection.
Right, so look at that. We're going to see it goes this way.
Yep.
So you're going to see, look at that nice point right there.
It hasn't shifted, it's right where it's supposed to be.
So you do the same thing,
Keep
put these
repeating
2
it.
together, and then put the 2 rows together to make a block. And you'll need 20 of those blocks for the quilt, and you can see the one on the wall. You put it together with 5 rows with 4 in each, and you have your flight pattern quilt.
Thanks for joining us today.
To see more of our videos, go to video.fonsandporter.com.